Assalamu alaikum, everyone, and I'd like to welcome everyone to another episode of the global voice of the Center for Muslim World Studies, Daanish TV English news channel. And it's a very special occasion today because someone that I have been in email correspondence with for a very long time, whose work, without any exaggeration, has contributed immensely to the way people involved in the global justice movement, people involved in countering Islamophobia for Muslims throughout the world, has been so deeply inspirational and almost as a guidebook to kind of understanding the situation that we've been undergoing since 9/11 and maybe even before as well. And so it gives me a great privilege and a delight to introduce Professor Arun Kundnani. Professor Arun Kundnani, welcome to the show.
Thank you very much for having me. It's good to be here.
And Professor Arun Kundnani's most well-known book, other books as well, at least for me and others, is, of course, the Muslims Are Coming, the Islamophobia, Extremism, and the Domestic War on Terror. And if you don't have a copy of the book, as provocative as that title may seem, at least for those viewers, and we have a global audience here, at least for those viewers and here in Pakistan, it's no problem having that with you on, you're on a bus ride or so on and so forth. Maybe other places, maybe you want to hide it or that type of thing. But otherwise, the book is phenomenal, and I think it does in one piece of work the work that we actually need to do to understand what has been going on throughout these years and what have been the specific type of policies that have been so utterly counterproductive in terms of dealing with the issue at hand that has emerged from what the scholar Mahmoud Mamdani calls the period of the late Cold War till the present. And so I think Arun Kundnani helps us navigate through those issues and problematize the way the Western democracies, or some call them plutocracies, the way they have dealt with this issue so misguidingly. So without further ado, and without further giving my own speech on the topic, I will ask Professor Kundnani basically around two main themes. And the first one is, of course, something that is incredibly topical and on the minds of Muslims and generally people who are involved in the global justice movement, justice and peace-seeking people throughout the world. And of course, it is part of the broader rise, of course, of a larger xenophobic, racist trends throughout, both in the West and in other areas, say something like in Modi's India or in Bolsonaro's Brazil and so on. But specifically for our purposes today, I wanted Professor Arun Kundnani to speak about the term Islamophobia. And the reason being is because now it's become much more part of the parlance. It's gained much more currency. The deployment of the term by well-meaning people, well-intentioned people. However, there may be some lack of clarity in kind of understanding what is it a reference to? Does it take us all the way back to the advent of Islam in the 7th century, to the Crusades, and so on, or how does particularly Professor Kundnani use this specific term, and how can that be an explanatory framework to kind of understand some of the broader issues that we're dealing with today? So, Professor Kundnani, can we begin by some of your reflections on the kind of discussion around Islamophobia and your own kind of personal approach towards the topic?
Yeah, sure. Thank you for that question. So, for me, if you think about the relationship between say Islam and those parts of Western Europe where Christianity has predominated historically, and then countries like the United States. I mean, that's a long history, you know, more than 1,000 years of history there, right? And the interactions have been, you know, you can't simplify those interactions over that period, you know, like sometimes there's animosity, sometimes there's mutual respect, sometimes there's dominations of one side or the other. It's a mixture, right? But what Islamophobia means to me is something much more recent and something much more specific. I see Islamophobia as a form of racism. It's therefore, like all racisms, it's a product of the modern world, of the scientific world, of the world of capitalism, right? And so it's a, you know, a recent thing. And specifically, you know, I would say it's something that you see emerging really in the, you know, as a form of racism. You see it emerging really from the kind of 1970s onwards, and then really strongly after the end of the Cold War in the early 1990s, right? And so if you look at people like Samuel Huntington or Bernard Lewis, kind of very influential Islamophobic intellectuals in the United States writing in the 1990s, they're kind of very open about it. They're saying, you know, with the end of the Cold War, communism is gone as the enemy that the United States will mobilize against, and we need a new enemy, right? These people think that the United States cannot exist unless it has an enemy, right? Because then people within the United States, instead of uniting against something outside, will start to ask questions about how the United States works. Right, for themselves. So their thinking is you need an external enemy, and communism is gone, we need a new one. And they quite openly say, well, Islam will serve this purpose because it's, you know, Islam can be presented as something that is racially alien to the West and threatening to the West, right? A certain story can be told, right? Now, you know, the process is complicated, and there's all kinds of factors that we take into account, but broadly speaking, that's what it is, right? And so it's about you know, about elites within the United States, within European countries, thinking about a story they can tell to their own people for political purposes, right? Yes. And it involves turning what is a religion into a race within that story. Right. Obviously, there are Muslims from every part of the world, and with every background, you can't define Islam as a race in itself, but you can tell a story in which you make Muslims into a race for a Western audience, right? That's
and let me just stop you right there, Professor Kundnani. When you say that turning Muslims into a race, could you elaborate a little bit on that for people who still believe that kind of race and races are, you know, biological categories that exist on their own, etc. And so therefore, how can a religious community, which are Muslims, these 1.3 billion Muslims throughout the world, how are we turning them into a race, and how does that make sense? So a little bit on that may help our viewership.
Yeah. So we've been, you know, one of the things that the modern world does is say to us, there are these things called races, and these are, you know, biological or nearly biological ways of categorizing people that somehow pass through blood or genes, or maybe through the transmission of culture in families, whatever that mechanism is. But somehow these categories fix us into these natural divisions that produce certain differences in behavior, in maybe intelligence, in values and attitudes, right? And this is a way of thinking that came out of Europe in the kind of 18th, 19th century, and now is, you know, kind of shared beyond Europe. But it's a fiction. Yeah, there's no scientific basis for dividing up the human species on the basis of something called race, right? So it's something that we have created as a fiction to divide up people, right? But having created it as a fiction, it becomes a reality, right? Like it starts to organize society. So that in the United States, if you are African American, your life expectancy is 10, 15 years shorter than it would be if you were white, right? Like it becomes a reality, right? So when I say that Islam was made into a race, what I'm saying is that there is a social and political process that's happened in in Europe and in the United States over a period of decades, where a certain fiction is being created that says Muslims are bound by nature to behave in certain ways, right?
Right.
Muslims are bound by nature to have a propensity to violence, right?
Right.
The stories are endless, like you can go through a long list of these stories that supposedly somehow Islam creates these behaviors in people, whether it's terrorism, extremism, in Europe, there's stuff about being rapists, pedophiles, there's ideas around oppressing women, not respecting human rights. The list is very long. But in all of these accounts, what's being said is fundamentally that these behaviors that are imagined to be common amongst Muslims are somehow a product simply of being a Muslim, right? Like nothing.
Right.
If you can obviously find some people who are Muslims who carry out acts of violence, right? In Europe, in other parts of the world, right?
Sure.
The argument that these Islamophobes make is you don't need to know anything more about that person's life to explain why they did that. You just need to know one thing: they were Muslim. That tells you everything you need to know. In reality, of course, you need to know a hell of a lot more, right? What is that person's biography? The acts of violence are typically products of some kind of political conflict, some kind of political process, right?
Absolutely.
Islamophobia says, throw all that to one side. All you need to know is this is a behavior that can be explained because of the way that Islam works. It's a race theory of Islam.
Right. And I think that this points to the larger point that what we have moved in some ways from is a very crude form, although perhaps in the phenomena of Trumpism, we may revert to that older, cruder version of kind of biological racism to a form of cultural racism. That I think that other authors, someone say like Maxime Rodinson spoke about theologocentrism, the idea that, and this is something that I know you go into very well, that Muslim theology or Muslim religion and the culture of Islam is the cause of Muslim terrorism, Muslim violence, and so on. Mahmoud Mamdani's, of course, famous chapter on culture talk. But I think, and this is not in any way to say that just because you're here that you have done it the best, but certainly your work makes it incredibly clear about how the kind of empirical studies and all of this on this question between the relationship between Muslim theology, Muslim ideology, and violence and terrorism is more or less empirically inaccurate, to be put it mildly, bogus to put it at best. And so if you could speak on that,
right, you don't have to mince your words, right? There's been junk science, right? It's junk science,
right?
And it's not more or less empirically false. It's simply false. I mean, there's no ambiguity, right? So the theory that was proposed, and this came from, all the intelligence agencies in the West proposed this after 9/11, in years after 9/11, right? And because they were credited by the media and by politicians, it became the standard theory accepted by everyone, right? The so-called radicalization theory. And what this theory said is that the cause of terrorism is not Islam itself necessarily, but some extremist interpretation of Islam, some extremist ideology, right? And this became the standard theory. So if you accept that theory,
and this was both on the liberal and conservative side. This discussion would take place, as you point out. Yeah,
it was accepted by everyone, right? And if you accept that theory, then how do you stop terrorism? Well, you stop the ideology, right? That's the root cause of terrorism, if you believe this theory. And so how do you stop an ideology? Ideology just means the ideas that are in people's heads. Well, that means you have to impose restrictions on people's civil liberties, right? You have to say, you can't say that. Right?
And I like the way Professor Kundnani, you say that, okay, for the neoconservatives and those, well, all of Islam is just basically inherently bad. But But even the kind of liberal response to that is kind of like, well, no, wait a second. There's these some Islamists, bad political Islamists, and if only we can get the right interpretation of Muslim theology, and we can get those nice verses from the Quran out, that will solve the problem. And the basic premise of that Muslim theology is the cause of whether we see violence or terrorism or so on. That's not questioned at all. I love the way you put that. Yeah.
So it becomes very interesting, especially in Europe, right, where you have a very common way of talking about the question of Islam in Europe is to say Europe is a secular society, right, and Islam doesn't accept secularism, right, and that's the basic problem. But then when you come to this question of talking about extremist ideology, what governments in Europe have been saying is the problem is a misinterpretation of Islam. So we as governments now need to tell you the correct interpretation of Islam, and in fact impose restrictions on imams and on Muslim institutions on what interpretation of Islam is considered acceptable and what is unacceptable. So now what that means is you have a European government calling themselves secular, but actually deciding what is the correct interpretation of a religion, which is anti-secular, right? So
absolutely.
There is some contradictions that come up here that are very revealing, right? And so
as I always point out, Professor Kundnani, I mean, the US government, of course, and constitutionally, this whole kind of notion of the separation of church and state, of religion and state, and the non-establishment clause, all of these. And so we really look at it as, okay, well, it will not interfere in kind of religion in that sense, whether that's true or not historically is a separate issue. But in our presence over the past period of the war on terror, we have seen literally not just the US government, the British government, other governments, the German government, invest billions of dollars in trying to forge a type of Islam that is compatible with the needs of Western foreign policy, effectively.
Exactly.
So the hypocrisy and the contradictions and the double standards in that are just too clear.
Absolutely. And it all rests on this bogus theory, right? The radicalization theory.
Yes.
And as well as the billions of euros and dollars and pounds, as you say, that have been spent to try and create a kind of pro-Western officially supported Islam in the West. There's also been huge amounts of money spent on supporting academic research and scientific research to try to prove the radicalization theory, right? There's been no shortage of funds for academics or think tanks who want to try and find evidence for this theory, right? Is there a correlation, between extremist ideology and acts of violence, right? And it turns out there isn't. And despite all this money, they've not been able to find the evidence to prove their theory, right?
And you mentioned some of the signs or stages that they see within this process of seeing a Muslim being so-called radicalized, which are to us may seem humorous, but of course these have been very dangerous and tragic tactics that have been used.
Yeah. So in New York, the New York Police Department developed an account of what it considered to be the indicators of radicalization. And what it said is there's 4 stages that you go through. Stage 1, you're just a regular Muslim living in New York City. The last stage, stage 4, you're a terrorist. And then stages 2 and 3, there's supposedly these indicators that you're on this process. What's on those indicators? Things like giving up smoking. Right. So, I say to Muslims in New York City, don't give up smoking, because it's much healthier for you to carry on smoking, right? Because the police department considers that a sign that you're becoming a terrorist, right? Things, what they describe as wearing traditional Islamic clothing, growing a beard, these are considered signs of radicalization. In the UK, there's something called the Prevent policy, which requires everyone who works in the public services, so teachers, doctors, youth workers, anyone who provides some kind of public service, these people have to have training in the so-called indicators of radicalization, so that when they're working, especially with young Muslims, they can look out for these supposed signs of radicalization and then report that to the authorities. So you end up with situations where, children in nursery schools, that means children who are 4 years old, are being reported to the authorities because maybe they drew something that looks a little bit violent which is what 4-year-old kids do. This is the craziness that we've got to, right? Where we've institutionalized these Islamophobic logics, and
absolutely. And I love the way that you have often mentioned, because it's one of my favorite movies, the movie Minority Report, and the way that that is an analog to the way that this whole radicalization theory has unfolded. Could you mention a little bit about that? Maybe the movie, the plot itself, what it was trying to do in the movie, and it eventually failed to do, and in some ways how analogous it is to what we are seeing today with the radicalization theory.
So in the movie Minority Report, which I think came out in maybe 2002, it's a Steven Spielberg film. The premise of the film is that in the future there are the police have these three women who are called precogs, who somehow have this ability to see into the future, and so they can see crimes that are going to happen in the future but haven't happened yet, and so then the police can go and arrest people before they've committed the crime for which they're going to be prosecuted. Right? It becomes possible to do that kind of preemptive policing if you genuinely have a way to see into the future, right? And in the film, what happens is that one of the police officers finds out that he is going to commit a murder in the future, or seems to, and obviously that screws the whole system, and you can imagine the ending, right? But in the real world, of course, we don't have the ability to see into the future. Right? That's not something that is in our human capacities. So but what's happened is that with these radicalization theories, police departments have been able to persuade us that they can see into the future, because they think that they have this scientific accuracy in the theory that says, well, if you're in stage 3 of the radicalization process, we know that you aren't a terrorist yet, but you're going to be. Right? You've grown a beard, you're wearing this kind of clothing, you've joined this mosque, that means you're ticking all the boxes right now, you're not breaking any laws, but you're going to in the future. So what are we going to do then? We might not be able to arrest you and prosecute you for terrorism, because you're in stage 3, you haven't become a terrorist, but we can do other things to you, to harm you. Maybe if you're a foreign national, we can deport you. Maybe we can find a way to entrap you, and these are the kinds of things that happen, right? And so it's an idea of preemptive policing, right? And it's a very dangerous idea, because it involves essentially prosecuting people for things they haven't done yet.
Absolutely. And just to hit it home one more time, Professor Kundnani, going back to the topic of Islamophobia, which you very correctly define as a form of anti-Muslim structural racism that has certainly accompanied the entire enterprise of the global war on terrorism. One of the things that I see as incredibly compelling to back this up is that the idea that needs to be repeated time and time again to people is that the enormous toll that this has taken on Muslim lives throughout the world. I mean, just the body count of the invasions of Muslims' lands and so on, that in some ways, that just like old colonial times, this cannot take place without an incredible level of dehumanizing the other, which is part and parcel of Islamophobia.
Exactly. So, I mean, we don't know the numbers for sure, right? I mean, I think we have some estimates, but if you look at there's something called the Watson Institute at Brown University in the United States. They've done some work on this to try and estimate the numbers. On their estimate, something like 500,000 people have been killed just in, if you just take Iraq, Afghanistan, and Pakistan, 500,000 killed directly by US military violence, right? So that's the ones that we know about, the documented numbers, right? Probably the number is double if you take into account not just the result of direct military actions, but the indirect consequences that follow from that. So if you know, in Iraq, you know, for every person who's directly killed by the US military, there'll be someone else who's killed because of malnutrition, or the destruction of infrastructure that comes with that war, right? So probably we're looking at, in those 3 countries, you know, forget for the moment the other countries where the US has also fought wars, like Libya, Somalia, Yemen, and so forth, right? But just in those 3 countries, Iraq, Afghanistan, and Pakistan, you know, 1 million people killed, right? In acts of violence that are not, you know, these are wars that are illegal in every sense. They are completely unjustified. They have no basis, right? They're pure acts of aggression. So, you know, when we think about that number,
and not even mentioning the more than 10 million, the refugee crisis that has been created from these,
right, and then the refugees as well, and so if you think about, you know, especially in Europe, I think there's a sort of sense of you know, a history of genocides and of mass incidents of state violence, right? Violence carried out by governments, by nation states, that, you know, that people feel is important to commemorate, right? So obviously the Nazi genocide of Jews, it stands out. But then also you might think of, you know, Armenia in the early 20th century. You might think of Rwanda in the 1990s. You know, we now need to add the war on terror to that list, right?
That's right.
To say, you know, there was a genocidal series of wars carried out by the United States and allies like the United Kingdom, that resulted in 1 million people killed, something like the same number in Rwanda, right? And this was pure aggression, motivated and made possible, as you say, by the dehumanization of the people in those countries, right? And they were dehumanized as Muslims. It was Islam and Muslimness that was dehumanized, right? Without that, these wars wouldn't have been possible. I mean, the United States, you know, if you're going to mobilize a whole country like the United States to carry out that kind of violence and take the lives of 1 million fellow human beings, that's only possible if you tell the people in that country who are paying for that violence, and, you know, and as recruits to the military actually carrying it out, it's only possible for that to happen if you tell your people a story about why it's absolutely crucial for this violence to take place, right? And what is the story that the United States told its own people? It said, Muslims are the scariest thing you can imagine, right? They are fanatics. They are extremists. They are hardwired for violence. Unless we kill them first, they will kill us.
Precisely.
That was the story. That was the racist story that was told, right? That resulted in 1 million deaths. Exactly the same logic as the story that the Nazis told Germans about Jews. Exactly the same story that the Hutus told, who, you know, in Rwanda about Tutsis and so forth, right? It's the same thing.
And it's colonial origins with the white man's burden, the civilizing mission, and so on. Absolutely.
And we haven't even begun. Go ahead.
Sure. No, I was just going to say that Professor Kundnani, we've spoken a little bit on, in fact, quite extensively on the complete shortcomings of this, the radicalization theory. We have, of course, another term that has entered not only within the Western plutocracies, but also within a variety of Muslim majority contexts. And that is the term of the CVE programs, countering violent extremism programs. Now, is there some distinction between the standard kind of radicalization theory, or at least is that what it rests upon? And what I wanted you to do is kind of very quickly just mention some of the shortcomings of that approach, the limitations of that approach, and what in fact, how counterproductive that is in terms of when they say that we want to build kind of some type of rapport with the Muslim community, Muslim leaders, etc. What exactly is going on there that is actually not so straightforwardly in the sense that they want to convey it?
Yeah. So if you think back, I mean, I think it's worth just spending a minute on the history here, right? So if you think back to, as we were just talking about, the war in Iraq, right, in 2003. Now, in fact, the United States is defeated in Iraq, right? I mean, we don't mention it here, but that's what happened. The United States was defeated, and it was unable to even unite the Western countries around fighting that war because France and Germany, as you remember, didn't want to have anything to do with it, although behind the scenes they did have a little to do with it, but officially they weren't part of it, right? So after that, the strategy, the sort of strategy of the George W. Bush White House of just fighting wars to topple these regimes was discredited, right? So they needed to come up with another strategy, and the strategy they came up with was what they called a strategy against violent extremism. What they said is, we won't be able to win these battles that we're trying to fight just by force alone. We can't win it just by military means. We also need to win it by ideological means. Then the phrase that then you hear always is, we need to not only do the shock and awe. That was the phrase used to describe the bombing of Baghdad. But we also need the hearts and minds, right? We need to be able to win over people, right? And so the idea was to develop an ideological campaign around the world that would separate what they would call the extremists from the moderates amongst Muslims, right? And the idea was that if you can do that, then the West will be able to prevail in the broader agenda of the war on terror, right? And so then the question is, how do you identify who are the moderates and who are the extremists, which is something that is never settled and is always ambiguous. And if you think that you're a moderate for 1 minute, say something critical of, for example, the Western foreign policy, and next thing you know, you're an extremist, right? And you're on the wrong side of the fence. So that there was always that instability in these categories. But then also, how do you win over the moderates? Well, you provide, all kinds of empowerment to those, especially the moderate, the people in the Muslim communities who are willing to offer a message that Western governments liked. They would be empowered with money and funding and access to large audiences and so forth, right? So we got a whole series of projects in the heyday of the war on terror, especially the kind of late 2000s and then into the Obama years. We got a whole series of initiatives that were covert. These were secret at the time, to try and swing opinion in the so-called Muslim world in favor of the West, right? And the war on terror. So, for example, people in the US government were saying, maybe if we, can fund a Bollywood movie, because we know lots of people watch Bollywood movies, right? Maybe we can fund a Bollywood movie that conveys this message that, that we need to support the war on terror. Maybe we can make TV programs that are broadcast in Pakistan. Maybe we can, pay for the people in the Muslim community in the UK who are very supportive of the war on terror, for them to be on TV a lot and for them to travel around and speak a lot so that their voice gets amplified. So people got rich. People in the UK made a lot of money.
And at the most extreme end, how can we get them to see the Israel-Palestine conflict as a conflict just between Muslims and Jews learning to get along with each other, and therefore sending some Muslims to Israel to kind of to legitimize
exactly right. So then, there's another strand of this that is all about normalizing Israel's military occupation in Palestine, right? And that's been a thing that's come up very recently here in the United States as well. So I mean, and that's that's another part of this. I mean, a lot of the stuff that we see in the war on terror, you can see it originally is things that have come out of Israel, right? In its own kind of war on terror, if you like, in the region around Palestine, right? So,
that's right.
You know, for example, the New York Police Department's whole counterterrorism program is lifted from how Israel's program works in the West Bank.
Right. Right. Absolutely. Absolutely. And Professor Kundnani, I just wanted to end on this. The CVE programs, what have been there? I mean, what has been the effect of them, and how have they been so incredibly short-sighted and counterproductive in the objective that they want to achieve?
Yeah, so you know, CV programs are based on this same radicalization theory. Again, they focus on ideology, right, which is the big mistake they make, rather than thinking about what are the actual political problems that underlie, you know, violent conflicts in the world. We say, well, no, it's not a political thing that needs some kind of negotiated process like any other conflict. Instead, we need to focus on the ideology, and we need to win these ideological wars in these ways, right? And so it results in, you know, one of the big consequences for me is that it results in a misunderstanding of what is really going on with these kinds of conflicts, right? Second thing is it involves mass surveillance, because if you start with this idea that we need to distinguish the moderates from the extremists, well, you need to know what every Muslim is saying and thinking in order to know which ones are the moderates and which ones are the extremists, right? And so you know, it justifies elaborate surveillance programs, which is what we've seen in Europe and in the United States. And then, you know, all kinds of...
And of course, this moderate and extremist, these categories are almost meaningless, except for in probably the most meaning that they carry is in the realm of politics, is in the realm of, are you a depoliticized, passive Muslim willing to accept the demands of Western foreign policy, or are you not?
Right, exactly.
And most of the meaning could mean that.
Exactly. So in practice, how you get to be categorized as an extremist is, you know, are you someone who is advocating for the Palestinian cause? Are you someone who is critical of Western foreign policy in the Middle East or in South Asia or in North Africa, right? Are you someone who wants to point to the practices of anti-Muslim racism in Europe? You know, like if you do these things and you do it in a way where you do not, you know, if you do it and you're A, Muslim, and B, you have some kind of following amongst Muslims, then you will be considered an extremist.
Right. That's right. That's right.
Whereas, of course, you know, engaging in these kinds of conversations and talking about these problems is precisely what democracy is, right? It's the opposite of extremism, right? Like, we don't prevent violence by not talking about things. Talking about things is how we stop violence, because as long as we're talking about it, we're not fighting each other over it, you know?
Exactly. I love this point that you make. It's an incredibly important one. The idea to suppress which is an incredibly powerful one right now that is taking place within the Western plutocracies that have our mosques, our communities, the Muslim communities. Don't talk about politics. Don't talk about these things. This is what it means to be a good American. Right. In fact, as you point out, I mean, how can it be? It's in fact the exact opposite. In fact, to discuss these issues, I mean, if you want to read the Constitution and so on and all of that thing, is actually the only way to actually flesh out these issues and have a civil discourse that can advance, you know, a discussion, disagreement, debate in a legitimate way, rather than the type of repressive measures that would probably induce a few individuals to then carry out some type of a violent act. I think that's a great point you make.
That's exactly right. And, you know, these kind of contradictions are exactly what it feels like to be targeted by racism, right? Like racism always works that way, where it says, oh, these people are refusing to participate in democracy. So then you start to have Muslims standing in elections and suddenly, oh no, Muslims are infiltrating the system, right? You can't win no matter what you do. And that's how you know that you're dealing with something called racism, right? Because it sets up these traps you can never actually... you know, the danger is to think that you need to play their game to win. You need what Muslim communities in Europe need to do is to like every struggle of peoples who've experienced racism. You know, what has always been the important point here is define who you are first. Right. Don't allow yourself to be defined by people who are racist towards you and follow their rules of who you are. Define yourself first, and from that basis, then mobilize and organize to assert your democratic rights, to assert your human rights. That's always, the first step.
Absolutely. And Professor Kundnani, if we can end on, and I hope you do remember, because I loved it very much. I knew of it before, but I was recalled to that statement by Martin Luther King in Birmingham jail, when he expressed before entering jail and getting these messages from many of the white liberals who wanted to ally with the larger civil rights movement, but were increasingly starting to perceive him as an extremist. Mm-hmm. I'm wondering if you can remind us of kind of what he said from jail on this term when he was increasingly being identified as an extremist.
He's being accused of being an extremist, and so he says at first he's distressed that
and perhaps who Martin Luther King Jr. was, just in case for our viewership.
Yeah, sure. So Martin Luther King was, a leader who came out of the black struggle in the southern states of the United States in the 1950s, struggling against what was called Jim Crow segregation, which meant black people at that time, in the South couldn't vote. They were forced to segregate from white people in public life and so forth, right? And that regime of inequality was maintained through extreme violence. So Martin Luther King was, one of the leaders of the movement to challenge that system of racism. And at one point he was arrested the other Christian leaders. He was a reverend. He's a Christian leader.
Yes.
Other Christian leaders wrote to him and said they felt that the strategies he was using to challenge that racism were extremist strategies, because what he was doing was civil disobedience. He'd become familiar with Gandhi's techniques against British colonialism and was using the same technique. So being arrested was part of the tactics that he was using, right? That's why he was arrested. So when he read these letters from other Christian leaders saying that you're becoming an extremist, he was at first distressed, but then he said, actually, there's no shame in being an extremist for peace and for justice, right? And what I like about that is that it shows that the term extremist is ultimately a political term, right? It's a term that is used always as an accusation against someone else who you disagree with, right?
Right.
And in itself, it's a meaningless term because, wait a few years later, this is the late 1950s. 10 years later, people are rushing to Martin Luther King and saying, please be the leader that speaks for black people, because there's these other people who are extremists like Malcolm X who are much more scary. And the Black Panther Party were much more scary. If only there was, if only everyone followed Martin Luther King, the moderate, we'd be okay, right?
Right.
Yesterday's extremist becomes today's moderate and vice versa. It just depends on the political context, right? So these are meaningless terms.
That's a beautiful way to put it. Exactly. Professor Kundnani, unfortunately, we're out of time, but this was a tour de force interview in the amount of time that we had with you. I think I want to apologize for picking your brain on kind of the topics that I'm familiar with reading, not just your book, but the vast corpus of literature that you've written on these subjects and that I've learned an incredible amount from. So I really wanted to thank you for joining us today, for joining our viewership today, and for leaving us with these incredibly insightful remarks of yours. So thank you, Professor Kundnani, for joining us today.
Thank you very much for having me, and it's really good to know that my work's been of use to you. So thank you.
Thanks, Professor Kundnani. You take care. Bye-bye.
And you. Bye.